The name of our talk is Modern Slavery and ESG. My name is Matt Friedman. I'm the CEO of an organization called the Mekong Club. The Mekong Club works with the private sector in a positive, supportive way to help them to understand the issue of human trafficking and what it is that they need to do in order to address it. So what I'm going to do initially is to just talk a little bit about the modern slavery issue, to lay some context to help the viewers to get a general sense of what we're talking about here when we talk about modern slavery and terminology like human trafficking and forced labor. To begin with, there are a certain number of industries that I would describe as being traditional industries. When most people think about human trafficking, they think about the girl in the picture on the left, forced prostitution. For good reason, there are 4.8 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. We've all heard the stories about how they are tricked and deceived and forced into situations where they will be with 8, 10, 12 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years they're used out and thrown out onto the street. And because of the moral repugnance associated with that, that gets a lot of attention. But there are also other forms of human trafficking, forced labor. And what I'd like to do is to go through a couple of these cases. In one case, a guy from Myanmar goes to Thailand. He's looking for work. He goes to a place called Sumit Sakan. He knocks on the door. The manager comes out and says, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for a job." Manager says, "Okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent of $50 a month, but you can't leave the factory." He's thinking, wow, I've never made more than $25. Now I'll make $50. He immediately accepts the offer, goes into the factory, works under horrific conditions, but at least in the back of his mind, he knows that he'll be able to send this money home. After a couple of months, he goes to the manager and says, "I'd like to be paid." The manager said, "Well, I forgot to mention one thing. It costs $54 for you to stay here. I'm only paying you $50. In fact, you owe me money and you can't leave." So this poor guy is in this situation where he's trapped, where every day he works, he gets more indebted, more and more into this situation where he can't leave. Or a guy in a fishing boat, 15-year-old, who is told that he can go out on a boat for a couple of months, he'll make a whole bunch of money, he'll come back, everyone's going to be happy, his family, himself. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out there for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 14, 15, 16 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten and tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there will be rice and fish. They often give strong stimulants to him so that basically his body is stimulated. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in, he gets nothing. Another form of human trafficking. Or a construction site situation. A guy from Laos goes to the construction worker manager in Thailand. He basically says, "I'm looking for a job." The manager says, "Okay, I'll give you a job, but I can't pay you for the first 3 months." He's thinking, wow, this is a great opportunity. I'll make some money. No problem. I'll wait 3 months. 3 months comes. He goes to the manager. The manager says, "You need to wait another 2 months." And then another 2 months. After a while, this guy is so indebted. He has so much kind of money that he owes. He gets very frustrated. He goes to the manager and he complains. The manager says, "Just don't worry about it. I'll take care of this tomorrow." The next day, an immigration police officer comes, takes this guy, sends him across the border. He was never going to get paid. This type of scam is very much seen in this part of the world here in Asia. But it's not just those traditional things we're seeing. We're also seeing other emerging risks. I made a presentation to a pharmaceutical company. This company, after I made the presentation, said, "We're a pharmaceutical company. We don't have to be concerned about this. We're very high tech. We treat our employees very well." So I looked at them and I said, "Well, how do you distribute your product?" And they said, "Well, we have some of our own trucks, but we use third-party distributors." "Have you ever looked into the distributors?" "No." They looked into it, and a couple of months later, they came back and they said, "We found modern slavery there." I made a presentation to a law firm. Law firm says, "We're a law firm. We don't have to be concerned about this." "Well, who cleans your building?" Never looked into it. They looked into it, and they came to realize that there was exploitation that was taking place there as well. What about when you buy furniture? What about when you buy supplies or uniforms? Those orders could be tainted by modern slavery as well. The point that I'm making is that as the light shines in all different types of sectors, you have a situation where the potential for there being an issue is very much there. So I've used human trafficking and modern slavery almost interchangeably, but there's a difference between them. So 35 years ago, when we were beginning to see these cases, what we thought was that human trafficking was very much about a person going from one country to another. And so because movement was important, they said, let's use the word trafficking. Kind of like drug trafficking. You take the drugs, you move it to someplace else, and then you sell it, or arms trafficking. In this particular case, you had human beings. But over time, what happened is people said, well, wait a minute. It isn't about how a person gets to a place, whether they go from one country to another, or from one district within a country to another district, or from one side of the street to the other side of the street. Isn't the exploitation the important part of the process? So when they looked for terminology that reflected what we were talking about, a situation where a person didn't get paid, they couldn't leave, there was physical violence, all of these things, they said slavery is the best term. But because most people see slavery as something that happened a long time ago, they put the word modern next to it. So human trafficking is kind of like the process by which a person gets into the endpoint, which is modern slavery, but you'll hear them used interchangeably. When it comes to the number of people who are in this situation, it's estimated there's about 40 million people in modern slavery around the world. In fact, according to the United Nations, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. Out of the 40 million, about 25 million of them are in what's called forced labor, and 16 million of them are associated with the supply chains, or the private sector, the banking sector, the hospitality sector. So you can see the relevance of this particular topic to the private sector. Post-COVID, we anticipate that that number will go up significantly. Why? Well, let me give an example. A person in Bangladesh, she has a job in a garment factory. She's happy with her paycheck, but she lives paycheck to paycheck. She has no savings. All of a sudden, COVID hits. What happens? Factory closes down, orders dried up, she's sent home, she's put into quarantine. She has no money to survive, so she borrows money. That indebtedness creates a situation where the person who lent the money can basically exploit you or her. In this particular case, well, if you can't pay this money back, I need one of your family members to go off to a brothel or off to a sweatshop or off to a fishing boat to pay back your debt. So you can see how it is modern slavery can be escalated over time. The rate of exploitation is the number of people that enter in different time frames. So in a year, about 9.2 million people. In a day, 25,200. Just imagine that. 1,000 an hour or a new slave every 4 seconds. So if we count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody's entering into modern slavery, and the drum beats on and on and on. When it comes to who's supposed to address this or who has traditionally been working on this, it's usually the governments or the United Nations or civil society and the NGOs. But to put the success of their efforts into perspective, last year, out of 40 million people, they only helped 108,000 of them. That's 0.2% of the victims. Out of 500,000 criminals, only 9,000 of them were basically put in jail, which is 0.8%. When you hear these statistics, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are they not doing their job? Are they lazy? That's not the issue. The issue is this. The profits generated from modern slavery are estimated to be 150 billion US dollars a year, second only to drug trafficking as a transnational crime. The amount of money that's available to fight this is about 350 million or 0.23% of the profits. Profits are this big, the response amount of money is this big. To put this into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, 6 billion US dollars worth. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the amount of money that we have globally to fight this scourge called human trafficking. You can see what the problem is. Another issue is scale. There's about 20,000 do-gooder, NGO, government-type people like me against 500,000 greed, incentivized criminals. We have to follow rules and regulations. They don't. Whenever somebody's coming close to them, they just evolve or mutate into something else. And lastly, awareness. The awareness of this particular topic is abysmal. I get in front of a lot of audiences that they simply don't know what human trafficking is. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to why this topic in the past that was traditionally more of a developmental kind of UN NGO topic has switched over to the private sector. And a lot of it comes down to that number of 0.2%. When governments came to realize that, in fact, the NGO and the governments and the United Nations weren't able to have much of an impact, and because many of the victims were associated with supply chains, they said, we have to get the business world involved. So they kind of introduced a series of things. Many of them are kind of like business risks, but I'd like to go through them very quickly. The first one is legislation. So prior to 2012, you had forced labor laws in place, but it never really affected the brands or the corporations. The first law that came out was the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act. This act basically said if you're a big company and you have profits of $100 million in either retail or manufacturing, and you have a single product in California, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address the problem. If you're not doing anything at all, you're in compliance, but you have to say something. This is transparency legislation, which means that people can see what companies are doing or not doing. A couple of years later, the UK Modern Slavery Act lowered it from 100 million to 36 million pounds, but they added a couple of additional things to it. Number one, an annual report. Number two, this would be signed by the board of directors. Then the Australia one added to that. They have a registry, they review what the inputs are, they give feedback. So with each incarnation of transparency legislation, they add something more to it. The German legislation that's coming out in 2023 has fines and penalties. We expect the same to happen with the Canadian legislation. And so what we're seeing is legislation is kind of driving companies in the direction of understanding that they need to address this. Another thing is lawsuits. We see major retailers that basically are being sued, for example, buying seafood from Thailand because the plaintiffs are saying it's tainted by modern slavery. You need to stop doing that or find a way of cleaning those supply chains up. In one case, they actually wanted on the side of the tuna fish for there to be a warning that says this product could be tainted by modern slavery. Not a really good selling point for a product. Obviously, this is a reputational risk and has the potential of creating a situation where a company could be embarrassed. You have organizations that go after companies. For example, palm oil is an industry that is considered to be fraught with exploitation. And so these organizations will have a list of 8 million people. They'll send an email to each of these people saying, here's a company, they're working with palm oil, we think they're doing a bad thing. Send them an email saying that you really care about this issue and they should change their approach. You can imagine if you're the compliance officer for that particular individual and you come in on a Monday and find 8 million angry emails, not a good day for that company. And lastly, breaking news. You know, the media coverage of this has basically for the last 5 years doubled every year. Why? Because this is a very titillating topic. It's a topic of interest. People want to know about it. And the more media attention you get, the more media attention grows out of that. When it comes to ESG, as we know, environment, governance, and social, addresses a voluntary framework that was put in place so big companies could demonstrate what they were doing as it relates to the environment and to communities and workers. And basically, investors would use this information to determine whether or not a company had risk and was viable in doing the right thing. But when COVID came in, all of a sudden, ESG went from a voluntary type of situation to kind of an expectation that everyone needs to, if you're a big company, demonstrate that you are a company of purpose. So it's not just about profit, prestige, and growth. You also have to demonstrate through ESG what's going to happen with your company in the future as it relates to these various factors. You'll hear a lot about that in a few minutes. But why this is relevant from the private sector standpoint is millennials care about this. According to one study, 84% of them cared about ESG impact. And these same millennials will be the fund managers of the future. They're going to be the ones that are basically making decisions related to kind of how investments are done in the future. So the investment community were the ones that were brought into this to set up ESG, but the expectation is that consumers will also be looking to take this information related to ESG and use it as a basis for their own consumer behavior. When it comes to kind of the relevance of this to different sectors, I mentioned the manufacturing and the retail sector. Let me talk a little bit about banks. Why would banks be interested in this? Well, because if $50 billion is generated from modern slavery, and any of that money gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. That bank will be fined. One Australia bank was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars for allowing an online sexual exploitation of children situation take place. So the banks are aggressively looking at this. Hospitality, why would they be concerned? Well, they have 4 factors. They have construction, which could be a problem. They buy things, so supply chains could be fraught with modern slavery. They bring migrants from different locations, so there could be third-party contracts that are exploitative, or sex trafficking. In the United States, hotels and motels are actually being sued now because if a 14-year-old girl had been used for sex trafficking and she recognizes the hotel, they're suing the hotels to say, you should have known better. She should have been protected in your hotel. And they're winning. And the problem for the hotel industry is that the insurance companies don't want to basically insure the hotel industry because they're the ones that are paying this. So when it comes to how we kind of measure forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking, the International Labor Organization has indicators. There are 11 of them. I'll just describe a couple of them. One of them is indebtedness. So if a person enters into a process of migration where they are indebted and they owe $3,000, and then there's all kinds of debt and additional fees attached with that, that holds that person away. It takes their free will and their freedom away. So there can't be that indebtedness. And so a lot of companies try to make sure that that doesn't exist. Or if a person goes to another country and their documentation is taken, that documentation is needed for that person to leave. If they say, I don't like this, I want to go home, the company can say, well, you can't. We have your documentation. We're not going to give it back. So all of these indicators really do make a difference. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop and hand it over to the next presenter, Adam Harper, and then we'll continue with an emphasis on ESG.
Hi, I'm Adam Harper from Ashbury Communications. Today, what I want to try and do is give you an introduction to this whole environmental, social, and governance, or ESG phenomenon, and try to explain a little bit about how it relates to modern slavery. This is really the story of how finance and investing can play its part in delivering a better world for all of us, but really only if it can decide on a common approach to how it thinks about modern slavery. What I want to try and do in the next few minutes is unpack the rise of this whole ESG phenomenon, which is really changing investment, and explain some of the key concepts to you. I want to show that forced labor and modern slavery are increasingly important to investors who follow ESG principles, not to mention consumers and employees. So let's begin with the pandemic, which has changed ESG investment like it's changed everything else. According to the finite pool of worry hypothesis, which you may have heard of, humans have only limited emotional resources for worrying. So that when we become worried about something, let's say we're feeling unwell, we can't worry about other things, let's say our financial situation. What we've seen during the pandemic is unusual, though. Even as we dealt with this once-in-a-century outbreak of an infectious disease spreading around the world, people actually became more concerned about other critical questions, like the state of our planet and the fairness of the societies that we lived in. So much for the finite pool of worry hypothesis. It's almost like the pandemic changed everything. The pandemic that changed everything has really only awakened our hunger for more meaningful change in all areas of life. I'm sure you'll all have seen and perhaps felt the hope that existed around the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November 2021. Maybe you were also a little bit disappointed with some of the results that came out of that. But around the world, there is a growing sense that radical change is required in our financial system and our economy to support a better future for humanity, and that it is possible for businesses and for investors to do well by doing good. What we're seeing today is that trillions of dollars are being invested in accordance with principles of responsibility that were considered fringe or peripheral just a few decades ago. Social norms and priorities are being reshaped at pace. And as our cultures and values evolve, so does the way that we invest. Perhaps for the first time in the history of modern capitalism, which some people think goes back 500 years, financial profit is not the only factor that investors are taking into account when they put money to work. This revolution in finance has many names. People talk about responsible investing, they talk about sustainable investing. The term that is becoming very widely used, and which I mentioned before, is an acronym, ESG, or Environmental, Social, and Governance Factors. But ESG investing is very much a work in progress. While investor demand for ESG products, funds, and so on is very strong, concerns are also mounting about the quality and integrity of ESG products, as well as their standards, data collection, and reporting. It is clear that real change is taking place in companies around the world. More and more firms are setting their own net zero targets for emissions, as well as social justice goals, targets for minorities and women to be represented in their management teams. But it's also clear that today's shareholders, today's consumers, and today's employees want more change, and they want it faster. And that applies to forced labor and modern slavery, as well as these other factors. So let's talk a little bit about the story of ESG. As everyone who's listening in today knows, the world's aspirations for humanity and for the planet are enshrined in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them. And broadly speaking, ESG is an investment framework for investors who want their capital, their money, to support those 17 goals. As I'm sure you all know, those goals include climate action, an end to poverty and hunger, decent work, and economic growth. Key things that you really need to know about ESG investment right now is that it's already huge and it's growing really fast. The numbers are staggering, and beware, I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you now. Global ESG assets, that's money that's being managed in accordance with ESG principles, are on track to exceed $50 trillion by 2025, according to Bloomberg. That's more than 1/3 of all of the financial assets under management that are projected to exist at that time. And already the signatories to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which is a voluntary code for investors, collectively have more than $121 trillion of assets. It's a colossal amount of money. And if you put that in perspective, the GDP of the United States last year in 2021 was $23 trillion. So you are talking about the kind of volume of capital that can really make a difference to the world. According to Morningstar, which is a data provider, sustainable mutual funds and ESG-focused exchange-traded funds rose globally by 54% in 2021, the volume of money that they managed, to $2.7 trillion, with a net $596 billion flowing into those strategies. And this demand for shares in companies considered to have good ESG credentials naturally drove up their value last year, enabling them to outperform the stock market as a whole. What we saw last year was the MSCI World ESG Leaders Index, and that's a measure of companies that are considered to be strong in ESG, had risen by over 25% during the year, compared with 22% for MSCI's biggest measure of global equities as a whole. Obviously, equity markets have been more volatile in 2022, but that gives you a sense of the strength of demand for ESG stocks. ESG, or sustainable financing, has also gained huge momentum. And what I'm talking about here are products like green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, where the proceeds go to purposes that are considered sustainable. According to S&P Global Ratings, that's a credit ratings firm, in 2021, $92 billion of sustainability-linked bonds were issued. That's an increase of nearly 1,000% over the previous year. Green bonds at $532 billion of issuance in 2021 were up 87%. But what we are finding is that there's increasing skepticism, as I mentioned. Some people are questioning whether there's really enough demand to match the frantic rate of new ESG fund launches. Other people, and this has been in the news a lot recently, are questioning how ESG some of these funds are. You might have seen in last year, the former head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, which is the world's biggest asset manager, said, in truth, sustainable investing boils down to little more than marketing hype, PR spin, and disingenuous promises from the investment community. And that kind of skepticism and pushback against claims that are being made for ESG funds is something that is increasingly prominent. We also see that for all of their growth and potential, ESG funds are a small part of the overall investment universe, at least for the time being. ESG and exchange-traded funds account for a little more than 1% of the whole US industry by assets, although they attracted about 4% of the allocations made to exchange-traded funds last year. But the structural growth trend is clear. And exactly what constitutes a company with strong ESG credentials, though, or an ESG fund, is a lot less clear. And that's what I want to turn to next. ESG investment approaches are evolving. Broadly speaking, investors started out by following what you might call an exclusionary approach. They decided to screen out companies from sectors that they saw as being incompatible with ESG principles like tobacco, arms, or fossil fuels. Today, the focus is much more on integrating ESG considerations into decisions about how an investment portfolio is constructed. And that approach really seeks to reward companies that are considered to be performing well against ESG metrics. But this is where it gets complicated. Because while the world has a set of common ambitions for its future in the form of the Sustainable Development Goals, it is much more difficult to judge how well companies are performing in contributing to the realization of those goals, or managing the risks of not doing so. Investors need a consistent approach to measuring ESG performance and risk. Otherwise, how do they know who's really performing well or not performing well in ESG terms? But they really confront what you might call a mosaic of different approaches and standards. And you can see here some of the companies and organizations that offer ESG ratings, ESG principles, and so on. And without commonly accepted standards based on very robust disclosure, it's quite hard for investors to make informed decisions about how good the ESG performance of different companies is and to allocate their capital accordingly. Major investors like BlackRock, who I mentioned, are pushing for more common standards to be adopted. Progress is being made when it comes to climate risk, for example. The International Sustainability Standards Board, which was launched at COP26, and the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure provide some vital common accounting and disclosure standards, although for now, only a minority of publicly traded companies use them. There are also plenty of other standard-setting bodies when it comes to climate finance. Modern slavery is increasingly important to investors, and they're forming coalitions to take action. And these include Votes Against Slavery, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, and Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking. These alliances are incredibly important in terms of those investors engaging with companies, telling them what their expectations are, and encouraging them to take action. And that's what we would call those investors exercising their stewardship responsibility. But the lack of a framework that's aligned to a target and which can allow a company to demonstrate progress on forced labor means that ESG investors often have to rely on the exclusionary approach that we talked about, which is a little bit more old-fashioned these days. That means that they eliminate companies that are reported to have had human rights violations from their portfolios. The problem with that is it's retrospective. You only know about it once a human rights or modern slavery abuse has taken place and been reported. Shareholder services firms and other providers give investors tools to monitor news and find out when these kind of things have happened. They can take action. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not the complete answer. So investor responses to modern slavery are maturing. Increasingly, the investor community recognizes that when you have long and complex supply chains, you have an increased risk of forced labor in those supply chains. And they're encouraging companies to identify and disclose violations. But enabling those investors to differentiate between companies that are doing well and being proactive and those that are not really requires us to have a shared goal when it comes to forced labor in supply chains. And that was the purpose that the Mekong Club and its partners, including Ashbury, had last year when we announced what we called the Moon Goal. And that was the objective of eliminating forced labor from private sector supply chains by 2030, a target that the whole industry and investors could work towards. I think that's very important in bringing action together. Now, to wrap this up, I hope it's clear that ESG is the big investment trend of our times, and it's only going to get bigger. It's maturing, it's changing. Some of the assumptions behind it are being challenged, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that ESG is increasingly going to become the standard for investment. And that has enormous consequences for companies and investors everywhere. But ESG's growth potential and its ability to have a positive impact will be limited unless the investment industry can begin to converge around those common standards that I talked about, whether that's on climate, whether it's on different social measures, or it's on forced labor. Without better assessment and disclosure of the risk of forced labor in supply chains, those investors will not be able to make much of an impact in eliminating this evil. They have tremendous capital and resources that they can bring to bear against the human traffickers and those who perpetuate slavery, but really understanding where the risk is essential to them doing that. So the biggest challenge for ESG investment, and arguably for financial support for the SDGs as a whole, will be better common standards, better disclosure, and better measurement. Thank you very much.
At the Mekong Club, we work with private sector companies across multiple different industries, from financial services to hospitality, pharmaceuticals, retail, manufacturing, and many others. As we have outlined in this session so far, investors care about how companies address modern slavery as a part of ESG. I'm now going to talk about some practical steps that companies can take to develop and maintain a comprehensive modern slavery strategy that meets these expectations and demonstrates leadership. First, companies need to assess and understand where they stand today. So this requires taking a very honest look at their existing modern slavery strategy and seeing how these measure up to legislation, industry standards, and of course, ESG expectations. Usually, this requires collaboration between multiple departments all coming together to take a very frank look at the steps that they're currently taking against modern slavery, identifying where strategies are working, where they're not, and where there's opportunity for greater action. So the following are some examples of the metrics that can be used to make this initial assessment. Whether there are policies and procedures in place prohibiting modern slavery, forced labor, and irresponsible recruitment practices. Or maybe whether suppliers are required to commit to address modern slavery as part of their contract with the company, or how staff are trained on the topic of modern slavery, as well as whether any modern slavery due diligence is conducted before engaging in new business relationships. Crucially, whether workers in the supply chain are able to report any grievances and seek help if they need it. It's also very important to consider whether there's a process in place to react if modern slavery is found, and how effective this process has been in the past. There are many factors that make up a modern slavery strategy, and figuring out where the gaps are is often the very first step in this process. Once the company has established how effective its modern slavery strategy is, a strategic plan needs to be developed. This plan should include specific and measurable targets. An effective plan will include a range of factors from developing policies, procedures, to risk assessment, training staff, engaging suppliers, conducting checks, and ensuring that measures are in place to protect and support any modern slavery victims if they're identified. Modern slavery is not an issue that can be tackled alone. Companies will need to engage multiple stakeholder groups in order to execute this strategic plan. This may involve speaking with suppliers to outline the company's expectations. It may involve engaging with workers themselves to explain their rights and check on their working conditions. It may also involve engaging with NGOs to support with fixing any issues if they are uncovered. Companies should take a collaborative approach to modern slavery and form partnerships wherever possible. There will be certain departments and staff members that have specific roles and responsibility related to modern slavery in any business. So identifying these staff and specifying the role that they play, along with specific goals that align to the overall modern slavery strategy, will really drive that accountability and help with the ESG reporting. Where possible, staff can be given KPIs that are specific to their role And some companies even tie staff bonuses to performance against ESG metrics. Of course, assigning responsibility must be coupled with training, so staff understand the importance of their role and the specific tasks that need to be undertaken. All staff in the company should have a general awareness of the issue of modern slavery, and then it's most likely that certain staff will have special responsibilities, so will need that extra training to know how to carry out their role. It's impossible to address modern slavery risk without first understanding the supply chains and the operations of the company, and actually identifying where that risk lies. This may involve identifying a list of the direct suppliers, otherwise known as Tier 1 suppliers. Many companies actually choose to publicly disclose this list on their websites in order to demonstrate transparency. Where possible, companies should strive to identify their suppliers' own suppliers too, so otherwise known as Tier 2, Tier 3, and so on. In the very best cases, companies are able to map a product from raw material all the way to the shop shelves. The more a company can demonstrate that they know how and where their supply chain operates, the better it is from an ESG perspective. Remember that a supply chain may not only include the people that make the products a company sells, but it could also include other suppliers like the staff who clean the shop floors, the workers in the office canteens, the security guards, and other such suppliers that may also be at risk. So part of this whole process should be identifying and reporting on these risks of exposure to modern slavery by understanding the whole supply chain. Certain countries and product types have an inherently higher risk of modern slavery. Understanding this risk is key to them putting in place the best protective measures. So once that risk is known and understood, it's then crucial to put in place due diligence against modern slavery. Some examples of how this can be done include asking your prospective new clients questions about how they address modern slavery, or maybe creating specific clauses within contracts that prohibit modern slavery and related bad practices, such as recruitment fees. Or maybe setting up new mechanisms so workers in the supply chain can report confidentially on their working conditions, as well as creating social audit programs to audit factories for potential modern slavery risks. There exists a wealth of tools and resources to help address modern slavery. Training can be enriched by tapping into experts and research. Apps can be used to help with engaging factory workers or assess working conditions as part of social audits. Data collection and analysis to better understand modern slavery risk can be made quicker, easier, and more accurate by using technology. There are also working groups and industry initiatives that companies can join to share with their peers and learn from each other. Finally, all of the activity that I've mentioned so far should be recorded and reported. This reporting will improve the company's ESG standings and demonstrate true leadership, encouraging others in the industry to do the same thing. Consumers and investors are increasingly rewarding those companies that are taking a very honest approach to this issue, outlining where they're succeeding, but also explaining how they're improving in addressing modern slavery. As this issue continues to grow in recognition and importance within ESG, we expect to see more standardization of the types of things that companies report on. Examples including the number of staff and stakeholders being trained, the extent of the supply chain that's been assessed for risk, the number of workers in the supply chain who have access to grievance reporting mechanisms, the types of volunteering initiatives that staff are involved in, and many other types of metrics. The Mekong Club has worked closely with the private sector for many years, focused solely on the topic of modern slavery. We exist to empower businesses to create a slave-free world. When companies engage with us, we first work with them to understand where they sit right now, using our confidential assessment process. We then equip those companies with a strategic plan that takes into account the specific risk factors of their country and industry footprints. We provide those tools, trainings, and resources to help them accomplish these plans and reflect and report on their own progress. Through this experience, we've identified that the private sector, investors, consumers alike, all care deeply about ending modern slavery. However, there's still much progress to be made across the board, from better defining what makes up a good strategy, to better metrics for measuring modern slavery and ESG, to more proactive sharing of data, knowledge, and resources.
So you've heard all this information about ESG and modern slavery. What is the call of action now? What is it that you should take away from this? Well, there are 5 things I'd like to mention. The first one is learning about modern slavery. When I say learning, I mean really going kind of deep into the topic to understand the relevance of this topic to your business sector. Every business sector has a little bit of a difference, and it's important to understand those nuances. The second one is to ensure your organization is addressing the topic. And with legislation basically requiring that companies have to do this, many companies are already doing this. But it's important to go beyond just audits and basically, grievance mechanisms to ensure that C-suite understands the issue, that you have policies and procedures in place that help to ensure that you know where your rudder is related to this topic, that you have training, that you have a focal person or a team, that you're doing risk assessments to determine where the vulnerability is. And of course, the audits and the grievance mechanisms. But if you find an issue, knowing what it is that you need to do in order to address it. You need to include indicators in ESG related to modern slavery. And once again, for a lot of major companies, this shouldn't be an issue because you're already tracking this for transparency legislation. You have the information that you need in order to be able to do this. It's really important for your staff to know about this. And what we're seeing and what my organization often is involved in is basically training from C-suite all the way down to the lowest level of the people within your organization, but also your contractors and your subcontractors and everybody else. And if that has to be done in multiple languages, by all means do that through e-learning, whatever mechanism makes a difference. And lastly, I encourage volunteerism on the topic. One thing that's very easy to do is just to, if you get information, share it on your social networking platforms so people know more about this. Talk to your family members, your colleagues, your community members. Help them to understand the issue. You can volunteer on the topic. Our organization has about 70 volunteers, mostly professional people, and when we need help, we basically put out a task order and somebody comes and says, this is what we want to do. This can be done from your home, it can be done from your business, but what it does is helps you to be a part of the solution. You can be a responsible consumer, which means that you can basically, before you buy products, go online to see if the company has a policy. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, in a very polite, respectful way, say, listen, I like your products. I'd feel better if you had a policy associated with this. And lastly, you can fundraise or donate. Organizations like ours and others are here to help you, here to support you, here to allow you to be a part of helping to address this issue. So in essence, ESG is going to help us all move in the direction of doing the right thing as it relates to modern slavery. That helps to protect your company, that helps to protect the people associated with your business, and it makes the world a better place. With that, thank you very much. We appreciate your attention. Thank you.